The city never really sleeps, but at 3 a.m. Manhattan feels like a different world. The streets, once flooded with honking cars and restless pedestrians, now lie eerily quiet. Neon signs flicker, their glow reflecting off the damp pavement. It's the witching hour, the time when the strangest affairs happen. Ethan had been driving for nearly 10 hours, exhaustion settling into his bones. His shift was almost over and he was ready to head home. Then the last ride request came in. A pickup near Central Park. Something about it didn't sit right. No name, just cash payment displayed on his screen. No profile picture. No rating. A red flag, but he needed the extra money. With a sigh, he accepted the ride and turned the wheel toward the park. As he approached the pickup spot, his headlights cut through the fog rolling off the trees. A lone figure stood at the curb, motionless. A woman dressed in a thin white dress, her long dark hair hiding her face. She didn't wave him down or move toward the car. She just stood there. Ethan hesitated. Something about her felt wrong. But the fare was already accepted. He unlocked the doors. Ethan exhaled and drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, the faint rhythm lost in the heavy quiet of the night. The dashboard lights bathed the inside of the cab in a soft greenish glow, flickering slightly as the engine idled. His phone screen still displayed the ride details. No destination entered. Just a pickup spot near the park, a nameless rider, and the promise of cash. The woman outside remained unmoving, her bare arms wrapped around her torso as if shielding herself from the cold, though the night was unusually warm. Her dress clung to her frame, slightly damp from the humidity in the air, the thin fabric swaying gently with the breeze. She stood at the very edge of the curb, inches from the street but not stepping forward, as if caught in a moment of indecision. Ethan had seen plenty of strange passengers in his years behind the wheel. Drunks too out of it to even remember where they lived. Couples whispering arguments through clenched teeth. Businessmen who rode in silence, their faces bathed in the cold glow of their phones. Nothing ever really surprised him anymore. But something about this woman was different. She wasn't swaying on her feet like a drunk, nor did she seem lost or confused. She was just still. He reached for the switch, unlocking the doors with a dull mechanical clunk. The sound seemed to startle her. Slowly, she turned her head toward the car, her face hidden behind the cascade of her dark, wet hair. The movement was slow, deliberate, like she was registering his presence for the first time. Ethan cleared his throat. "You called a cab?" No answer. He waited a beat, then leaned slightly toward the passenger window. "Miss, do you need a ride?" Still nothing. His foot hovered over the gas pedal, the urge to just drive away creeping up his spine. But then, without a word, she moved. Not hurriedly. Not hesitantly. Just moved. Her bare feet barely made a sound against the pavement as she stepped toward the car. The closer she got, the more Ethan could see the details in the dim streetlights, the way her dress was slightly torn at the hem, the way her arms hung stiffly at her sides, the way her breathing was so shallow it was almost imperceptible. She reached for the back door handle. A small, cold tremor ran through Ethan's fingers as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. A part of him, the logical part, knew he should just pull away. Refund the ride, lose a couple of bucks and go home. But another part of him, that quiet, instinctual part that all cab drivers develop over years of working these late hours, whispered something else. She needs help. With a slow creak, the back door opened. The woman slid inside without a sound, her movements unnervingly fluid. The door shut softly behind her. Ethan glanced at the rearview mirror. She was sitting completely upright in the middle of the back seat, hands resting lightly on her lap. Her face was still obscured by her long hair, strands clinging to her cheek. No shifting, no adjusting her dress, no pulling out a phone. Just sitting there waiting. He cleared his throat again. Where to?" For a long moment there was nothing. No response, no sound. Just the distant hum of the city outside, the occasional hiss of a passing car's tires on wet asphalt. Then finally she spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse like someone who hadn't spoken in days. "Drive." Ethan's fingers flexed against the wheel. "Yeah, but where?" "Pause. Then. Just drive." A chill crawled up his spine. Every instinct told him this was wrong. He needed to say no, make her get out, leave this whole thing behind. But his hand had already shifted to the gear stick. Almost against his own will, he eased his foot onto the gas. The car rolled forward. The city stretched out before them, a vast labyrinth of empty streets and blinking traffic lights. The farther they drove, the heavier the silence in the cab became. Ethan checked the mirror again. The woman hadn't moved an inch. The faint scent of something metallic lingered in the air. And then, just as he was about to say something, ask her again where she was headed, maybe even demand an answer, she did something that made his grip on the wheel tighten. His pulse spiked just a little faster. She turned her head. Not toward the window. Not toward the road. She turned toward him. Her face was still hidden in shadow, but he could feel her gaze. Heavy. Unblinking. Watching. Ethan swallowed. The meter ticked on. The city lights blurred outside. And the woman in the backseat just stared. The city unfurled before them in streaks of orange and blue, streetlights casting fleeting glows across the windshield. The cab moved steadily, humming over the cracked asphalt, its engine purring softly in the silence. Ethan kept one hand firm on the wheel, the other resting tensely on the gear shift, his fingers drumming out a nervous rhythm. The meter continued ticking, the red digits glowing faintly in the dark. The woman hadn't spoken again. Hadn't moved. She remained stiff in the backseat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the long strands of her damp hair clinging to her cheek. The only thing she had done, the only thing, was turn her head. Just enough to face him. Ethan tried not to look in the mirror. But the weight of her gaze made it impossible to ignore. He swallowed hard, forcing his eyes forward onto the road ahead. The route was aimless, no destination set, no address entered into the GPS. He had started off heading downtown, but now he found himself taking turns without thinking, following roads he didn't usually take at this hour. The streets here were quieter, the buildings older, their windows dark. No pedestrians. No cars. Just the occasional flicker of a neon sign from a 24-hour laundromat, the hum of a distant siren curling through the night. The silence inside the cab stretched on, thick and pressing. The radio had been left off, and all he could hear was the steady hum of the engine, the faint creak of the leather seats as the car rolled over uneven pavement. Ethan licked his lips, stealing a quick glance in the mirror. She was still staring. Not blinking. Not shifting. Just staring. A sharp, uneasy shudder ran down his spine. Look, he started, his own voice breaking the quiet like a sharp edge, rougher than he expected. He cleared his throat. I need an address. Or at least a direction. Can't just drive all night. She didn't answer. Didn't even react. Ethan forced out a dry chuckle, though it felt unnatural even to him. Meters running, you know. Nothing. He gripped the wheel tighter, his palms damp. He hated this. The feeling of being trapped inside his own cab, of not being in control. This wasn't how the job worked. Sure, weird stuff happened late at night, sketchy passengers, unsettling silences, but there were always rules. You pick someone up, you drive them, you drop them off. Simple. But this wasn't that. His fingers flexed. Something in his gut, something deep, told him to pull over. And this, get her out of the car and go home. But then, a whisper. So soft, he almost didn't catch it over the sound of the tires rolling against the pavement. Left. His breath caught. He turned his head slightly, his pulse quickening. What? Another whisper, barely audible. Turn left. A chill spread through his chest. He exhaled sharply, his grip tightening against the leather of the steering wheel. Pull over. Tell her to get out. But his hands moved on their own. The wheel turned. The cab veered left onto a narrow street. It was darker here. Fewer streetlights, the buildings taller and more compressed. The kind of road you wouldn't take unless you knew it well. A place that seemed forgotten by the rest of the city. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. Where are we going? He asked, his voice low, careful. The woman didn't respond. The cab kept moving forward, the buildings pressing in, the road stretching longer than it should have. Ethan flicked his eyes back to the mirror. She hadn't moved. But this time he could see more of her face. The way her lips were slightly parted, her skin too pale in the dim light. The way her breath barely fogged the window beside her. His stomach twisted. Something was wrong. The road ahead seemed to narrow, the streetlights growing farther apart, the darkness thickening between them. And then, softly, barely above the hum of the engine, she whispered again. Right? Ethan hesitated. His hands ached against the wheel, his knuckles white. A single thought pounded against his skull over and over. If I keep driving, I don't think I'm coming back. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story. The right turn led them down a street even narrower than the last, a passage of cracked asphalt and flickering streetlights, the glow from above barely enough to cut through the thickening dark. The buildings here were older brick facades worn by time, some windows boarded up, others left open to the night, black and hollow. The kind of street where shadows stretched too far, where the silence felt less like an absence of noise and more like a presence in itself. Ethan swallowed against the tightness in his throat, his fingers stiff where they curled around the wheel. The air inside the cab had changed. He hadn't noticed it at first, maybe because his mind had been too preoccupied with the woman in the back seat, but now it was unmistakable. The faint scent of something metallic, sharp like rust. Or blood. It clung to the inside of his nostrils, thin and sour. He exhaled slowly, forcing his focus back to the road. This wasn't right. None of it was. He wasn't even sure where he was anymore. He'd been driving these streets for years, long enough to know every shortcut, every dead end, every stretch of road that led nowhere good. But this? He didn't recognize this. The city didn't look like this. Not even at its worst. His hands flexed on the wheel. He needed to end this ride. No. The thought sent a pulse of clarity through him, cutting through the unease like a blade. He flicked his gaze to the rearview mirror. The woman hadn't moved. Not an inch. Still sitting upright, still staring. He clenched his jaw. Enough. His foot lifted off the gas. He reached for the meter, ready to hit cancel, to turn around and tell her hell, shouted her to get the fuck out of his cab. And then, softly like a breath against the dark, she spoke again. Stop. Ethan's pulse kicked. The word wasn't a request. It wasn't even a command. It was something else. Something final. His foot slammed the brake before he could even process what he was doing. The cab jerked to a stop in the middle of the street, tires scraping against the pavement. His breath came fast, sharp, rattling in his chest. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Silence pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating. Outside, the street was empty. Not a single car. Not a single pedestrian. Just the stillness of the buildings, the cold yellow glow of a lone street lamp, buzzing faintly above. Ethan gritted his teeth, his pulse hammering against his ribs. All right, he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. That's it. Ride's over. Nothing. Not a sound. He turned in his seat, half expecting to find her still sitting there, unmoving. But she wasn't. The back seat was empty. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His mind stuttered, trying to catch up to what he was seeing. The door hadn't opened. He hadn't heard it click, hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't heard anything. But she was gone. The seat where she had been was untouched, no indentation from where she had sat, no trace of dampness from her dress. Just empty, like she had never been there at all. His chest tightened. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. A trick of the light. A hallucination from exhaustion. That was it. Had to be. He reached up, rubbing a hand over his face, his skin cold with sweat. He needed to go home. Get out of this place. His fingers moved to shift the car into drive. And then, from somewhere outside. Ethan froze. The sound was soft, barely audible. A tap against the glass. From the backseat window. His breath locked in his throat. Slowly, so slowly, he turned his head. The window was fogged over. And through the haze, pressed against the glass, a hand. Still. Fingers splayed. And beyond it, through the thin, murky veil of condensation, a shadowed face, watching him. His heart slammed against his ribs. The tap came again. Louder this time. Not a knock. Not a demand. Just a reminder. That she was still here. That she had never left. Ethan's breath came ragged now, his pulse a violent thrum beneath his skin. His hands were shaking. And then, the door handle moved. The handle shifted again, a slow, deliberate pull. The dull metallic click of the mechanism sent a spike of cold straight through Ethan's spine. His breath stilled. The door was locked. He knew it was. He had never unlocked it after stopping. But the handle, it was still moving. He swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the wheel. Every muscle in his body locked, his mind screaming for him to hit the gas, to tear down the street and never look back. But something deeper, something primal held him frozen in place. The hand on the window remained there, fingers still splayed against the fogged glass. The outline of the face was barely visible beyond it, the features blurred, lost in the dim light. But he could feel it staring at him. Watching. Waiting. The door handle jerked harder this time. A test. A question. Would he let it in? A tremor crawled up his arms, his knuckles white as he clenched the wheel. His foot hovered over the pedal, the engine humming beneath him, ready to bolt. And then, a whisper. But not from outside. From the back seat. You shouldn't have stopped. The voice was wrong. Not loud, not soft, just there. Inside the cab, inside his head. Crawling beneath his skin like something slow and cold. Ethan's breath stuttered. His instinct screamed to turn to see. But he didn't. He wouldn't. He forced his eyes straight ahead, staring at the empty road. His pulse was a hammer in his chest, his lungs tight, fingers burning against the wheel. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His mouth was dry when he finally spoke, voice barely more than a whisper. "Who are you?" Silence. The hand on the window was gone. The door handle stilled. But he knew the thing in the backseat hadn't left. A breath so close he swore he could feel it against his neck. "Drive." Ethan flinched. His hands shook. The air in the cab felt heavier now, pressing against his skin, into his lungs, suffocating. The metallic scent was stronger, thick and wrong, clinging to the back of his throat. He could taste it. Another breath, closer this time. "Drive." His body moved before his mind could catch up. His foot slammed the gas. The tires shrieked against the pavement as the cab lurched forward, throwing him against the seat. The city blurred past in streaks of yellow and black, streetlights flashing through the windshield like the slow flicker of a dying film reel. Ethan didn't look in the mirror. Didn't dare. But he could feel it. Sitting there. Waiting. The needle on the speedometer crept higher. 50. 60. 70. The streets flew by in a smear of light and shadow. But no matter how fast he drove, the weight in the backseat didn't change. Didn't move. Didn't leave. The whisper came again, curling against the air, pressing into his skull like something cold and wet. "You were never supposed to stop." Ethan's hands clenched the wheel, his breath ragged. This wasn't happening. This was a dream. A hallucination. A trick of exhaustion. But the seatbelt behind him shifted. The soft drag of fabric. Something was leaning forward. Closer. Too close. The cab shook as he veered onto another street, his tires skidding over the wet pavement. Where was he even going? Where could he go? He had no destination. No way out. Only the road stretching ahead, empty and endless. And the thing in the backseat. That would not leave. The speedometer ticked past 75, the city blurring into streaks of gold and black. The cab's headlights cut through the wet sheen on the pavement, reflecting back like molten glass. Ethan's grip on the wheel was iron, his knuckles white, his breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. He didn't dare look in the mirror. Couldn't. The whisper was still in his ears, curling against the back of his neck, sinking into his bones. "You were never supposed to stop." The weight in the backseat had changed. Before it had been still. Silent. A presence he could only feel. But now it was leaning forward. He could sense it. The shift in the air. The barely audible creak of the leather seat as someone pressed closer. The scent of damp fabric, of something old and cold, laced with the metallic tang of rust. Or blood. Ethan's pulse pounded so hard it was making him dizzy. He focused on the road, the lane markers flashing by in rapid succession, his mind screaming at him to keep driving. But he was losing track of where he was. The streets didn't look right. He knew New York, every back alley, every shortcut, every stretch of road that could get him out of a bad situation. But now, as he sped through the city, nothing looked familiar. The buildings had changed, taller, darker, faceless monoliths pressing in from all sides. The streetlights were further apart, casting longer, more distorted shadows. The traffic lights weren't red or green anymore, just blank, lifeless husks, flickering as if caught in a loop. And worst of all, no cars. No pedestrians. No signs of life anywhere. Ethan's throat tightened. He flicked his eyes to the GPS, hoping for some sense of direction. But the screen was black. Not off. Not glitching. Just black. A void swallowing everything. His breath hitched. He risked a glance at the dashboard. The radio, the clock, the meter all dead. A cold sweat slid down his back. He was driving blind. No city. No road. Just an endless stretch of asphalt leading into nowhere. And behind him, still leaning closer, the voice returned, barely more than a breath against his ear. "Slow down." Ethan clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached. "No," he muttered, voice hoarse, shaking. "No, I'm done. You're not real. This isn't real." The whisper was closer now. "You have to slow down." His stomach clenched. Something was moving in the mirror. Not a reflection, a shadow. A shape behind him, impossible to define, shifting like smoke, like something that had never belonged to a body. It was wrong, stretching too far, too thin, its edges flickering as if it were struggling to stay in this world. Ethan's breath came fast and shallow. His hands burned against the wheel. He had to get out. Had to find a way back. But the road wouldn't end. It stretched on, winding through an impossible city, the buildings warping, twisting, folding in on themselves like something collapsing in slow motion. The sky above was no longer black. No longer anything, just a vast, empty space, as if the world had been erased beyond this road. And then, the seatbelt in the back pulled tight. Ethan choked on his breath. His veins turned to ice. Someone was strapping in, settling in, as if it had always been there, as if it belonged. And then, a new voice, a whisper layered over the first, a voice he hadn't heard before. "You missed your turn." The words settled into the cab like a weight, thick and suffocating. "You missed your turn." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His fingers were numb against the wheel, his mind fighting to grasp what was happening. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but the presence in the back seat, it was real. The seatbelt remained taut, locked across the unseen passenger's chest. The air felt heavier now, thick with something that wasn't just fear, but finality, like a moment stretched too far, like the past reaching forward and claiming him. His knuckles burned, his muscles locking up as he forced his foot down on the gas. The cab roared forward, but the speed no longer mattered. The road refused to end. The city outside the windows twisted into something unfamiliar, the buildings bending in impossible angles, their windows dark, hollow voids. Ethan wanted to scream, but his voice was useless here. "You missed your turn." The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't from the back seat. It was everywhere, weaving through the static in his ears, curling through the air vents, crawling into his bones. Something shifted in the mirror. The shape behind him, it was changing. What had been a shadow was gaining form. Not a person, not fully, but something that wanted to be. The outline of shoulders, a head tilted slightly, strands of wet hair clinging to a face he couldn't see. The weight of its presence pressed against his spine, cold and unwavering. Ethan clenched his jaw, sweat slipping down his temple. His mind screamed at him to wake up, to stop the car, to jump out if he had to. But the cab wasn't his anymore. The road wasn't his. The city wasn't his. Only the voice. Only the whisper. "Turn around." His heart hammered against his ribs. No, he wouldn't. Wouldn't turn the wheel, wouldn't obey whatever this was. But his own fingers began to move, twisting the wheel, guiding the car in an arc across the endless, empty road. The tires groaned against the pavement, the cab shuddering as it turned. And then, the city changed. Ethan barely had time to process it. One moment, the warped buildings loomed overhead, shifting, pulsing like something alive. The next, they snapped back into place, sharp lines, towering glass, the familiar geometry of New York reasserting itself. Streetlights returned to their steady glow, traffic signals flickered back to life. The road beneath him felt solid again. And yet, something was missing. The cab rolled to a stop. The engine idled, humming like a lullaby. Ethan's hands were locked on the wheel. His breaths came slow, uneven. He dared to look in the mirror. The back seat was empty. The seatbelt was unfastened, hanging loose against the worn leather. The smell of dampness had vanished. The air no longer held that sharp, metallic tang. Just the familiar scent of the city gasoline, concrete, the distant haze of fast food grease from a 24-hour diner. Ethan exhaled shakily. His limbs were still trembling, his stomach knotted so tight it felt like he'd be sick. He reached for the meter. The screen flickered back to life, red numbers glowing in the dark. It read "Fare collected." His fingers curled into his palm. The passenger was gone. But they had paid. A slow, nauseating chill crept through him. He fumbled for his phone, his pulse hammering as he pulled up the ride history. No record. Nothing. Like it had never happened. Ethan swallowed, gripping the wheel as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The street outside looked normal now, early morning New York, still half asleep, a few scattered headlights in the distance. The hum of the city returning as if nothing had ever disturbed it. But Ethan knew better. Because his cab was still waiting. The meter had reset. The time blinking at him. Next ride, 3:15 a.m. And beneath it, a new destination. A place he had never entered. A place he knew instinctively he shouldn't go. His hands clenched, his breath shaking as he stared at the screen. The city was waiting. The road was waiting. And whoever had ridden with him tonight, they were waiting too. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.